The early hours of July 28, 1976 seem no different from any other summer morning in Tangshan, a growing industrial city in northeastern China. Positioned in Hebei province, Tangshan was home to approximately 1 million people, many of whom were miners, factory workers, and their families. Life hummed along with an air of routine. Few could have imagined that this ordinary day would soon become etched in history as the setting for one of the deadliest earthquakes of the 20th century. At precisely 3:42 a.m., an earthquake struck with a magnitude of 7.5 on the Richter scale. Its epicenter was located just 12 kilometers beneath the surface, a shallow depth that would amplify its destructive power. The region's geological makeup played a critical role in the disaster. Tangshan was situated on loose sedimentary soil, which exacerbated the seismic waves as they radiated outward. These amplified tremors turned the earth beneath the city into a rolling, heaving force of devastation. Adding to the catastrophe, Tangshan's urban development was not prepared for such a seismic event. The city lacked earthquake-resistant infrastructure, and many of its buildings were constructed from unreinforced masonry and other substandard materials. This left them vulnerable to collapse under the earthquake's immense force. When the quake struck, entire city blocks were razed in seconds, leaving little standing in its wake. The immediate aftermath was horrifying. Entire families were buried beneath rubble as buildings crumbled like sandcastles. Streets buckled, bridges snapped, and water mains ruptured, flooding parts of the city and making rescue efforts even more challenging. The ground itself became a hazard as fissures opened up, swallowing anything or anyone in their path. Communication lines were severed, isolating Tangshan from the outside world and delaying the flow of critical information about the scale of the disaster. The timing of the earthquake added to the tragedy. Striking while most residents were asleep in their homes, the death toll skyrocketed as people were caught completely off guard. Survivors later recounted how they were jolted awake by violent shaking, only to be engulfed by collapsing walls and falling debris. Darkness, chaos, and confusion overwhelmed the city as cries for help echoed into the night. Despite its seismic significance, there were no foreshocks to serve as a warning. While some animals reportedly exhibited unusual behavior in the hours before the quake, such as dogs barking incessantly and livestock acting erratically, these signs were not enough to prompt human action. This absence of clear warning further underscores the unexpected nature of the disaster. In the hours following the quake, Tangshan's true plight remained hidden from the world. Limited communication and China's tightly controlled media meant that the full scale of the disaster would not emerge immediately. For now, Tangshan's residents were left to grapple with the immense destruction and loss, unaided and largely unnoticed by the outside world. This marked the beginning of a disaster whose ripple effects would extend far beyond its epicenter, reshaping disaster response, preparedness, and urban planning in China and beyond. As the clock struck 3:42 in the early hours of late July, the peaceful city of Tangshan, still shrouded in the stillness of night, was torn apart by a seismic upheaval unlike anything its residents had experienced. The earthquake's force was swift, brutal, and uncompromising, generating seismic waves that spread destruction across a staggering area of over 3,000 square kilometers. The ground heaved violently, transforming solid earth into a liquid-like phenomenon known as soil liquefaction, a catastrophic process that caused buildings to tilt, sink, or collapse entirely. While the epicenter was located within Tangshan, the earthquake's effects radiated far beyond the city. Surrounding towns and rural areas were hit hard, with entire communities flattened in mere seconds. Structures ranging from modest village homes to industrial facilities crumbled under their relentless vibrations. The region's coal mines, a vital part of Tangshan's economy, were particularly devastated, trapping hundreds of workers underground. For those miners, survival became a race against time as tunnels caved in, cutting off both air and escape routes. The damage extended to critical infrastructure, further compounding the chaos. Railways were twisted into grotesque shapes, severing vital transportation links. Power plants were rendered inoperable, plunging the area into darkness, while water pipelines shattered, leaving survivors without clean water. Bridges that once connected the city to nearby regions were reduced to piles of twisted steel and concrete, isolating Tangshan further from external aid. One of the earthquake's most haunting aspects was its sheer speed. Experts later estimated that the most intense shaking lasted less than 15 seconds, yet the destruction it wrought was monumental. This brevity meant that those who might have reacted to the tremors had virtually no time to escape. Survivors described the moments of impact as akin to an apocalyptic storm, walls collapsing, roofs caving in, and the air filling with a deafening roar as the ground moved beneath them. Adding to the horror, the earthquake struck during a heat wave, compounding the physical and emotional toll on survivors. Temperatures soared, and without shelter, clean water, or medical supplies, conditions rapidly deteriorated. Many were forced to endure the blistering heat while searching for loved ones or trying to rescue neighbors trapped beneath the rubble. The sweltering conditions also accelerated the decomposition of bodies, posing significant health risks and further traumatizing those who remained. Another tragic element of the disaster was the widespread loss of life among children. Many schools in Tangshan were not built to withstand even minor earthquakes, let alone a seismic event of this magnitude. As a result, countless young lives were lost when classrooms collapsed, burying students and teachers under tons of debris. These heart-wrenching scenes left an indelible scar on the community and would later fuel demands for stricter building regulations and earthquake preparedness. Meanwhile, survivors faced a terrifying landscape of ruin. Fires broke out across the city as ruptured gas lines ignited, creating an additional hazard for those navigating the wreckage. The air became thick with smoke, dust, and the cries of those in pain or mourning their losses. Every moment was a test of resilience as individuals banded together to lift debris, carry the injured to makeshift medical stations, or dig with their bare hands in desperate attempts to find loved ones. Despite the enormity of the disaster, Tangshan's plight initially remained largely unknown to the outside world. The destruction of communication lines and the isolated nature of the region created a chilling silence that left even neighboring cities unaware of the unfolding tragedy. For the people of Tangshan, this isolation deepened their sense of abandonment, as it became clear that immediate help was not on the way. These early hours marked a critical juncture in what would become one of history's most significant natural disasters, setting the stage for an unparalleled story of survival, loss, and resilience. The devastation caused by the Tangshan earthquake unfolded on an almost unimaginable scale. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, creating a vast expanse of destruction where homes, schools, factories, and hospitals once stood. Over 90% of the city's buildings were either damaged or completely destroyed, leaving the majority of Tangshan's population without shelter. The widespread collapse of infrastructure compounded the chaos, forcing survivors to confront a harsh and unforgiving reality in the earthquake's immediate aftermath. The industrial heart of Tangshan, once a bustling hub of economic activity, was obliterated. Factories that powered the region's economy lay in ruins, and heavy machinery was scattered like toys across the landscape. Among the hardest hit were coal mines, which suffered catastrophic collapses, burying hundreds of workers deep underground. These miners faced a desperate battle for survival, contending with toxic gas, flooding, and the ever-present risk of further cave-ins. Hospitals and medical facilities critical for treating the injured were not spared. Most were destroyed, and those that remained operational were overwhelmed within hours. Makeshift medical centers sprang up in open fields and among the debris, staffed by a few doctors and nurses who survived. Supplies of antibiotics, painkillers, and bandages were woefully inadequate, forcing medical workers to improvise treatments and prioritize the most critical cases. With the injured numbering in the tens of thousands, triage became a grim and inescapable task. Amidst the destruction, survivors faced immense challenges in securing basic necessities. Access to clean water was nearly non-existent, as pipelines had been shattered and wells contaminated. Food supplies dwindled rapidly, leaving many to scavenge through the wreckage or share meager rations. The summer heat exacerbated these hardships, with temperatures soaring above 37 degrees Celsius, further threatening the health of those already weakened by injury or exhaustion. Survivors banded together in an incredible display of human resilience and solidarity. Men, women, and even children took part in rescue efforts, using bare hands and simple tools to dig through the rubble. Makeshift teams formed spontaneously, driven by the shared hope of finding loved ones alive beneath the debris. Tragically, the majority of those trapped could not be saved, as the sheer scale of destruction and the lack of heavy rescue equipment hindered these efforts. The earthquake also inflicted devastating emotional wounds. Families were torn apart as countless lives were lost in an instant. The grief of those who survived was compounded by the uncertainty surrounding the fate of their loved ones. Makeshift memorials began appearing within days, with survivors placing flowers, candles, and personal mementos near the sites where friends and family had perished. Adding to the catastrophe, aftershocks continued to terrorize the region. These tremors, some significant in their own right, caused further collapses and heightened the fear of those already traumatized by the initial quake. For the residents of Tangshan, the ground beneath them seemed permanently unstable, and each aftershock was a cruel reminder of their vulnerability. As word of the disaster began to spread beyond Tangshan, nearby towns and villages grappled with their own losses. The destruction was not confined to the city alone. Smaller communities were equally devastated, though their struggles often went unnoticed in the shadow of Tangshan's catastrophe. These areas faced similar shortages of water, food, and medical supplies, further straining the limited resources available for relief efforts. In these early days, survival was a test of willpower and ingenuity. The residents of Tangshan and its surrounding areas displayed extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable adversity, setting the stage for a long and arduous recovery. The city's ruins bore silent witness to the resilience of its people, even as the true scope of the disaster was only beginning to emerge. In the months and years following the Tangshan earthquake, the true extent of the disaster became a defining moment in modern Chinese history. The challenges of rebuilding a shattered city, addressing the emotional scars of survivors, and honoring the memory of those lost created a legacy that would shape Tangshan and its people for generations. The Chinese government launched an unprecedented reconstruction effort. Within days of the disaster, engineers and construction crews from across the country descended on Tangshan. Entire neighborhoods were cleared of debris, and temporary shelters were erected to house the displaced population. Despite limited resources, the reconstruction process reflected a commitment to rebuilding not just the city's infrastructure, but its spirit. By the early 1980s, Tangshan began to transform into a symbol of resilience and recovery, with new buildings rising in place of the ruins. Public health initiatives also became a cornerstone of the post-disaster response. The widespread destruction of hospitals and sanitation facilities had led to fears of disease outbreaks. Medical teams worked tirelessly to vaccinate survivors and improve living conditions in temporary camps. Over time, Tangshan emerged as a model for public health planning in the aftermath of disasters, influencing emergency response strategies across China. For the survivors, the earthquake left deep psychological wounds. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of the disaster. Community support networks played a crucial role in helping individuals process their grief. Over the years, storytelling, art, and cultural events became powerful tools for healing, allowing survivors to share their experiences and honor the memories of loved ones. The Tangshan earthquake also catalyzed advancements in earthquake research and preparedness. The scale of destruction highlighted the need for improved building standards and stricter enforcement of construction codes. By the 1990s, Tangshan's new structures were built to withstand earthquakes, reflecting lessons learned from the tragedy. The disaster also spurred the development of early warning systems and a nationwide focus on earthquake education, which have since saved countless lives. Globally, the Tangshan earthquake drew attention to the importance of international solidarity in the face of natural disasters. Although China largely relied on internal resources, offers of aid from other countries marked a significant shift in global disaster response dynamics. The tragedy underscored the shared vulnerability of humanity and the need for collective action to mitigate the impact of such events. In Tangshan today, memorials stand as a testament to the lives lost and the resilience of those who survived. The Tangshan Earthquake Memorial Park, completed in the late 20th century, is a place of reflection and remembrance. Its design incorporates remnants of destroyed buildings and poignant sculptures, ensuring that the memory of the disaster remains alive for future generations. The earthquake also left an indelible mark on Chinese culture. It inspired literature, film, and academic studies, shaping the way disasters are understood and discussed. The stories of survival and courage from Tangshan resonate far beyond the city, serving as a reminder of humanity's strength in the face of unimaginable loss. As the decades have passed, Tangshan has risen from its darkest moment to become a thriving city once again. Its recovery is a testament to the resilience of its people, the power of community, and the lessons learned from one of history's most devastating natural disasters. The legacy of the Tangshan earthquake is not merely one of destruction, but also of rebuilding, healing, and hope for a better future. The story of the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami begins with one of the most intense geological events ever recorded. On December 26, 2004, a massive earthquake reaching a magnitude of 9.1 struck off the coast of Sumatra in Indonesia. This earthquake was not just any seismic event. It was a mega-thrust earthquake, the type that occurs at subduction zones where one tectonic plate is forced beneath another. In this case, the Indian plate was thrust beneath the Burma plate, resulting in an enormous release of energy. This sudden and violent shift caused the Earth's crust to rupture along an underwater fault line stretching for over 900 miles. The scale of this event was extraordinary. The earthquake not only caused destruction near its epicenter, but also shifted the Earth's axis by nearly an inch and slightly sped up the planet's rotation. Such a significant change in Earth's mass distribution is rare and speaks to the sheer force of the event. This release of tectonic energy displaced an enormous volume of seawater above the fault line, setting off a series of waves that would become the infamous Indian Ocean tsunami. Unlike ordinary waves, these tsunami waves moved with tremendous speed and were nearly undetectable on the ocean surface until they reached shallow coastal areas, where they rose to staggering heights. In the moments following the earthquake, scientists across the region began to sense its implications. The U.S. Geological Survey recorded the earthquake's initial shock waves and immediately recognized the potential for a massive tsunami. In countries with advanced warning systems, alerts were quickly issued. However, in many parts of Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and India, early warning systems were either non-existent or unable to reach affected communities in time. In the absence of rapid communication, many local residents remained unaware of the impending catastrophe, even as the waves began to move closer to their shores. What made this earthquake particularly destructive was its proximity to densely populated coastal areas. Southeast Asia is home to millions of people living along coastal communities, relying on the sea for their livelihoods and everyday life. These communities, which lined the beaches and fishing areas, were especially vulnerable. As the waves traveled across the Indian Ocean at speeds of up to 500 miles per hour, they gathered tremendous force. People living in coastal towns and villages were largely unprepared for what was coming, unaware of the magnitude of the disaster that was building offshore. In this context, understanding the Indian Ocean's geological setup is crucial. The region is a hotspot for seismic activity, lying at the intersection of the Eurasian, Australian, and Indian tectonic plates. Throughout history, this area has experienced significant earthquakes, but none had been as intense or as devastating as this one. Prior events, such as the 1833 and 1907 earthquakes in Sumatra, had caused tsunamis that served as reminders of the region's vulnerability. However, nothing could have prepared these communities for the scale of destruction that would follow in the wake of the 2004 earthquake. In the aftermath of the initial tremor, many along the coast reported strange occurrences, such as the sudden retreat of the ocean from the shore. Fish were left flopping on exposed seabeds, and curious locals ventured out to gather them, unaware that the retreat of the water was a warning sign of a tsunami. This phenomenon, known as drawback, is a rare but telling signal of an incoming wave. Tragically, many did not understand this sign, and in the moments after the earthquake, as the ocean pulled back, many people, particularly children, rushed to the beach, oblivious to the approaching danger. As this unprecedented natural disaster began to unfold, a wave of unimaginable scale and force was forming and bearing down on some of the most populated coastlines in the Indian Ocean. In these first critical minutes after the earthquake, the fates of hundreds of thousands of people across multiple nations were being sealed, even before the deadly waters made landfall. As the initial tremors subsided, the communities along the Indian Ocean's coastlines were still largely unaware of the disaster headed their way. In the wake of the 9.1 magnitude earthquake off Sumatra, the displaced water from the ocean floor triggered a tsunami of unprecedented scale. Moving silently and swiftly, the tsunami waves raced across the Indian Ocean at speeds close to 500 miles per hour, essentially as fast as a jetliner, yet invisible from above the water's surface. By the time they neared land, they transformed into towering walls of water, ready to unleash devastation upon the unsuspecting coastlines. The tsunami first struck the shores of Banda Aceh, a city in Indonesia located close to the earthquake's epicenter. Within less than 30 minutes of the earthquake, the powerful waves hit with full force, crashing into the coast and obliterating everything in their path. Buildings, homes, and vehicles were swept away as the waves surged inland, consuming entire neighborhoods. People who had survived the initial shock of the earthquake suddenly found themselves confronted with a rapidly rising wall of water. Many attempted to flee to higher ground, but with little time and almost no warning, thousands of lives were lost in those first crucial moments. As the waves continued outward from Banda Aceh, they reached other parts of Southeast Asia and beyond. Thailand, renowned for its tourist beaches and coastal resorts, was next. In places like Phuket and Khao Lak, tourists and locals alike had only moments to respond as the waves began to rise. Videos captured that day show the first small surges of water rushing up the beaches, seemingly harmless as people continued to enjoy their day, unaware of the imminent danger. But in minutes, these small surges escalated into massive, unstoppable waves that inundated hotels, shops, and restaurants along the shore. The sheer force of the water overwhelmed everything, pulling people and debris out to sea. The devastation spread far beyond Southeast Asia. In Sri Lanka, approximately 1,000 miles from the earthquake's epicenter, coastal towns were suddenly hit with powerful waves several hours after the initial quake. The eastern coastline was particularly affected, with towns like Batticaloa and Ampara witnessing catastrophic damage as the ocean surged inland. Houses were flattened, infrastructure was destroyed, and countless lives were lost. Fishing communities, whose livelihoods depended on the sea, were among the hardest hit as the waves swept away boats, nets, and coastal settlements. India, located to the west of Indonesia, was also heavily impacted. In the state of Tamil Nadu, the waves struck fishing villages along the southeastern coast, while other parts of India, including Kerala and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, faced severe destruction. In Chennai, the capital of Tamil Nadu, floodwaters surged through the streets, reaching far into urban areas that were unprepared for such an event. In the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which lay close to the earthquake's epicenter, entire communities were left isolated as the tsunami decimated local infrastructure and cut off communication with the mainland. The waves didn't stop at South Asia. The impact of the tsunami extended across the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as the eastern coast of Africa. In Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania, which are located thousands of miles from the earthquake's origin, the tsunami made landfall hours after the initial event, causing additional fatalities and destruction. While the impact in Africa was less severe than in Southeast Asia, the arrival of the waves was unexpected and devastating for those communities unaccustomed to such a disaster. Across the affected regions, the waves left behind unprecedented levels of destruction. Entire coastal villages were wiped out, homes and buildings were reduced to rubble, and thousands were separated from their families in the chaos. The power of the tsunami was such that it uprooted trees, overturned vehicles, and carried debris far inland. In a matter of hours, landscapes were transformed into scenes of desolation, with barely any structure left standing to mark the places that had once been vibrant communities. In this tragic moment, the resilience of the people was tested to its limits. Survivors found themselves in a sudden struggle for survival, searching for loved ones amidst the wreckage, and beginning to assess the true scale of the catastrophe. The Indian Ocean tsunami was not just a natural disaster, it was a profound human tragedy, affecting communities across multiple countries and leaving a lasting impact on the millions of lives it touched. In the days following the Indian Ocean tsunami, the full extent of the devastation began to emerge. Across the affected countries, an estimated 230,000 lives were lost, and millions of people found themselves homeless, with entire communities swept away. Survivors faced immediate challenges. Securing food, water, shelter, and medical aid became a critical priority, as local resources were overwhelmed by the unprecedented scale of the disaster. In Banda Aceh, one of the hardest hit areas, the aftermath was particularly dire. Hospitals were overrun with the injured, and makeshift shelters sprang up as survivors sought refuge from the debris-strewn landscape. Streets were lined with displaced residents who had lost everything, including family members and friends. Infrastructure had been shattered, with roads, bridges, and communication lines wiped out, making it nearly impossible to transport essential supplies. The Indonesian government, local volunteers, and international relief teams worked around the clock to provide food, water, and medical care to survivors, but the needs were overwhelming. The human impact extended well beyond the immediate loss of life and property. Families were torn apart, with many children orphaned by the disaster. In Thailand, entire communities mourned as hundreds of children were reported missing or found alone, separated from their parents. The emotional toll was immense. People who had escaped the waves struggled with grief, trauma, and shock. Schools, places of worship, and homes had been reduced to rubble, leaving survivors with not only a physical void, but a profound sense of loss. In Sri Lanka, the eastern coast had suffered extensive damage, with hundreds of fishing villages decimated. Survivors there faced unique challenges, as fishing was the main livelihood in these areas. Boats, equipment, and infrastructure essential to their work were destroyed, leaving families without a source of income and dependent on outside assistance. Efforts to provide aid were complicated by Sri Lanka's geography and the limited accessibility of many affected areas. Roads had been flooded or damaged, making it difficult for humanitarian organizations to reach the worst-hit regions. Despite the challenges, the international community rallied to provide support, with rescue teams and volunteers arriving to assist in the relief efforts. In India, the state of Tamil Nadu was among the hardest-hit areas. Coastal towns and cities were grappling with a severe shortage of clean drinking water and food, and local hospitals were stretched to their limits. Emergency response teams from within the country mobilized quickly, setting up camps and temporary housing for those displaced by the disaster. However, the sheer number of people in need made it an enormous logistical challenge, and resources were spread thin. Many of those affected were members of fishing communities who found themselves not only dealing with loss and displacement, but also with the destruction of their livelihoods. Across the Indian Ocean, the widespread impact was a reminder of the interconnectedness of these coastal communities. Even in distant locations like Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania, the waves caused damage, with coastal residents enduring flooding, property damage, and loss of life. Though the destruction in Africa was less severe than in Asia, it highlighted the far-reaching effects of the tsunami and underscored the need for a coordinated global response to disasters of this scale. In response to the catastrophe, international aid poured into the affected countries. Governments, organizations, and individuals worldwide joined in the relief efforts, raising billions of dollars to assist those in need. Aid agencies, including the United Nations, Red Cross, and numerous NGOs, mobilized swiftly to provide medical aid, food, shelter, and other necessities. Helicopters were used to reach remote areas inaccessible by land, delivering much-needed supplies and evacuating the injured. Volunteers from all over the world arrived to help rebuild and support the survivors, while local authorities worked to coordinate the influx of aid. For the survivors, recovery would take years, and rebuilding shattered communities was an enormous task. Many people faced long-term challenges, from psychological trauma to the loss of livelihoods, and the need for resources to rebuild homes, schools, and infrastructure was immense. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami not only reshaped the physical landscape, but also left an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of those affected, a lasting reminder of nature's power and the resilience of the human spirit. The story of the Mount St Helens eruption in 1980 is one of nature's most powerful and unforgettable moments. Before it erupted, Mount St Helens had been a quiet and dormant volcano for over 100 years. But nature had other plans, and in the months leading up to May, the mountain began showing signs that something big was about to happen. The first clues came in the form of unusual seismic activity. Scientists had long known that volcanic eruptions were preceded by earthquakes, but these were no ordinary quakes. Starting in mid-March of 1980, small but increasingly frequent earthquakes began to rattle the ground beneath the mountain. These tremors, while initially subtle, grew stronger and more persistent. By the end of the month, the quakes were being felt by residents living in the nearby towns of Washington state. The tremors were strong enough that people living in the area began to wonder if something more dangerous was at play. In addition to the earthquakes, other signs of volcanic activity became more pronounced. Scientists, including volcanologists at the United States Geological Survey, USGS, began to observe swelling on the mountain's north face. This was an indication that magma was rising beneath the surface, increasing the pressure inside the volcano. This swelling was the result of an accumulation of magma and gas beneath the ground, pushing outward and creating what is known as a bulge. As the weeks progressed, the tension surrounding the mountain grew. Local officials, aware of the growing threat, began evacuating residents from areas closest to the volcano, but the vast majority of people in Washington state had no idea how catastrophic this event would turn out to be. The concern was that Mount St Helens might be headed toward an eruption, but no one could have anticipated the scale of destruction that was about to unfold. On March 27, the volcano sent a dramatic warning shot. A series of powerful tremors caused a massive landslide on the north face of the mountain, resulting in a mud flow that swept across a 24-square-mile area. The eruption of debris and ash was a vivid reminder that Mount St Helens was waking up, but the worst was still to come. Scientists at the time believed that a major eruption was inevitable, but no one knew exactly when or how catastrophic it would be. These early warnings, however, set off alarms throughout the region, and government officials began preparing for what was to come. Residents living near the volcano grew anxious as they witnessed the increasing seismic activity. In some cases, buildings were damaged from the tremors, and the sky above the mountain was filled with an eerie glow from the increasing number of earthquakes. For weeks, the mountain had been signaling that it was about to burst, but what exactly would happen remained uncertain. People began to evacuate the area in large numbers, unsure if they would ever return home. The stage was set for what would become one of the deadliest and most destructive volcanic eruptions in United States history. As April arrived, the situation became even more serious. Scientists continued to monitor the volcano, and their findings indicated that the threat of a major eruption was becoming more imminent by the day. The frequency of the earthquakes continued to increase, and the bulge on the north face of Mount St Helens grew larger, a clear sign that magma was continuing to rise. The pressure building inside the volcano was mounting, and every small tremor felt like a reminder that the eruption could come at any moment. During this time, the US government and local authorities took steps to try to mitigate the threat. They declared a state of emergency, and on May 14th, the exclusion zone around Mount St Helens was expanded, forcing thousands of residents to evacuate. The National Guard was mobilized to assist with evacuation efforts, and the Army Corps of Engineers worked tirelessly to prevent flooding from the nearby rivers. With all this preparation, everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Little did they know that the events of May 18th would change everything, forever. As May approached in 1980, Mount St Helens continued to show alarming signs that it was ready to erupt. By now, the mountain had become a focal point for scientists, media, and residents alike. For weeks, the volcano had been shaking and groaning, as if awakening from its long slumber, but no one could predict exactly when or how it would erupt. The volcano's internal pressure was steadily increasing, and the landscape around it was beginning to change in dramatic and unexpected ways. The bulge on the north face of the volcano, which had grown steadily since March, became a major point of concern for volcanologists. This bulge, caused by the rising magma beneath the surface, was not only unsettling but also highly unstable. Experts feared that if the pressure within the volcano continued to increase, it could trigger a massive collapse, releasing an explosion of devastating force. The situation was becoming increasingly dire, and the danger was no longer just a possibility, it was becoming an inevitability. In the days leading up to the eruption, seismic activity reached a fever pitch. The quakes were no longer just tremors, they were powerful and violent shakes, rattling buildings and sending shock waves throughout the region. The mountain itself seemed to be trembling with energy, and the ground around it was becoming dangerously unstable. It wasn't just the residents of the nearby towns who felt the impact. These powerful earthquakes were now being felt hundreds of miles away. Amidst this growing unease, scientists were working around the clock to monitor the volcano's every move. Their primary concern was the potential for a lateral blast, a type of eruption where the volcano releases its energy sideways rather than straight up. This was a particularly dangerous scenario because it meant that the explosive force could travel across the surrounding landscape, flattening everything in its path. If this happened, there was little that anyone could do to escape the destruction. By mid-May, the volcano's ominous behavior had prompted officials to take even more drastic action. Evacuations were ramped up, with thousands more people being urged to leave the area. The government implemented roadblocks to prevent anyone from getting too close to the volcano, and the National Guard was deployed to help with evacuation efforts. Yet, despite the growing warnings, there were still some people who were reluctant to leave. Many residents, particularly those who had lived in the shadow of the mountain for years, were hesitant to abandon their homes, convinced that the volcano would not erupt or that the danger was overstated. But for the scientists and emergency responders, the threat was clear. Mount St Helens was on the brink of a catastrophic event. While the evacuation efforts continued, other precautions were being put in place to mitigate the possible effects of the eruption. The Army Corps of Engineers worked tirelessly to build temporary dams and barriers along the Toutle River, hoping to control any potential flooding caused by the eruption. Flooding was a real concern, as the intense heat of the eruption could melt the snow on the mountain, sending torrents of water, mud, and ash rushing down into the valleys below. It was a race against time, as the threat of an eruption loomed larger with each passing hour. Meanwhile, the growing volcanic activity continued to shake the landscape. Landslides were becoming more frequent, and the slopes of Mount St Helens were gradually being stripped of trees and vegetation. A few days before the eruption, on May 17th, scientists detected a massive collapse on the volcano's north face, which was followed by an enormous earthquake. This event was the final warning sign that the volcano's pressure was about to reach a breaking point. Everyone knew that it was only a matter of time before Mount St Helens would unleash its fury. At the same time, the media frenzy surrounding the eruption reached new heights. Journalists from around the world flocked to the area, eager to document the impending disaster. Helicopter footage of the swollen mountain and the surrounding areas began to fill the news broadcasts. People watched with bated breath as scientists, journalists, and emergency workers all braced for the inevitable. In the days before May 18th, some of the most seasoned volcano experts in the world were still unsure about exactly what would happen next. They had studied volcanic eruptions for years, but the potential force of an eruption like the one Mount St Helens seemed poised to unleash was unprecedented. Would it be a gentle steam release, or would it be a catastrophic explosion that could level everything in its path? Unfortunately, the world would soon find out, but no one could have prepared for the scale of devastation that would follow. The morning of May 18th, 1980, started like any other spring day in the Pacific Northwest, calm, quiet, and deceptively serene. But beneath the surface, Mount St. Helens was preparing to unleash its fury. The seismic activity had been intensifying for weeks, but now it was no longer just a threat. It was an impending catastrophe. The people living in the nearby towns, though aware of the growing danger, had no idea that the eruption would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. At 8:32 a.m., all that changed. The earth beneath Mount St. Helens rumbled, and the pressure built to its breaking point. Without warning, the volcano erupted with an explosive force that shook the entire region and could be heard as far as 200 miles away. What followed was not just a typical volcanic eruption, but one of the most violent and devastating explosions in modern history. The eruption began with a massive lateral blast, unlike any eruption ever seen before. The north face of Mount St. Helens, which had been bulging ominously for weeks, collapsed in a massive landslide. This was no ordinary landslide. This was the beginning of a catastrophic release of energy. As the landslide slid down the mountain, it triggered a violent eruption that sent a massive wall of ash, gas, and rock shooting out sideways at speeds of up to 300 miles per hour. The sheer force of the blast flattened everything in its path. Trees were snapped like matchsticks, and entire forests were obliterated across a 230 square mile area. The land was scoured clean, leaving behind a desolate wasteland. The intensity of the explosion was so powerful that it changed the landscape of the area forever. The eruption was followed by a massive ash cloud that rose high into the sky, reaching altitudes of over 80,000 feet, high enough to disrupt air travel across much of the United States. The cloud of ash spread quickly, darkening the skies and blocking out the sun. For those near the volcano, the skies turned an eerie, sulfurous yellow, and the air grew thick with ash, making it difficult to breathe. As the ash began to settle, it became clear just how catastrophic the eruption had been. The initial blast had been just the beginning. Over the course of the next 9 hours, Mount St. Helens continued to erupt, sending more ash and debris into the atmosphere and creating pyroclastic flows, fast-moving avalanches of hot gas, rock, and ash that raced down the mountainside. The eruption's energy was so intense that it was equivalent to the explosive power of 1,600 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. As the ash continued to spread across the region, it brought with it darkness and chaos. The thick ash cloud affected not just the local communities, but also areas hundreds of miles away. In Seattle, more than 200 miles to the northwest, the sky darkened to an unnatural twilight, and the air was thick with dust. Roads were covered in ash, and the landscape was completely transformed. The eruption was felt across the western United States, with ash falling as far as Colorado. It was a surreal, apocalyptic scene, one that seemed to stretch on for days. While the eruption raged on, the immediate aftermath was devastating. The shockwave of the explosion reached as far as the nearby towns, and the surrounding area was quickly blanketed in ash. By the time the eruption had subsided, the town of Spirit Lake was unrecognizable. The lake itself had been choked with debris, and entire sections of forest had been obliterated. Rescue efforts became nearly impossible, as the ash created an impenetrable layer over the land, burying roads, homes, and anything else in its wake. Communication lines were severed, and the region was cut off from the outside world. The most tragic aspect of the eruption was the loss of life. 57 people were confirmed dead, though many others were feared to have perished in the eruption's wake. Among the casualties were local residents, scientists, and adventurers who had been observing the volcano's activity in the days leading up to the eruption. One of the most notable victims was volcanologist David A. Johnston, who was stationed at an observation post near the mountain. As he communicated with the U.S. Geological Survey, Johnston's final words were chilling. "Vancouver, this is it," before he was tragically killed in the eruption. His death, along with the deaths of many others, was a sobering reminder of the unpredictable and deadly nature of volcanic eruptions. As the ash continued to fall, the volcano's eruption sparked not just widespread destruction, but also a deep sense of awe at the raw power of nature. What had once been a quiet and dormant volcano had now become one of the most violent and destructive natural disasters in history. The eruption of Mount St Helens had left a lasting scar on the landscape, but it also changed the way scientists would approach volcanic eruptions in the future, and served as a stark reminder of the unpredictable forces at work beneath the Earth's surface. The eruption of Mount St Helens on May 18, 1980, had forever altered the landscape of Washington state, but the true scale of its aftermath was not fully realized until days, months, and even years later. The immediate devastation left behind was staggering. The once thriving forested areas were now reduced to barren wastelands, stripped of vegetation, wildlife, and the towering trees that had defined the region for centuries. Entire ecosystems were wiped out, and the Earth itself was left scarred, as if nature had been reset in an instant. In the wake of the eruption, the human toll was devastating. The loss of 57 lives, many of whom had been in the danger zone despite evacuation orders, was just the beginning of the broader, long-term consequences. Hundreds of homes were destroyed, and entire communities found themselves displaced, with people left to rebuild their lives from the ground up. The destruction of the timber industry alone was a blow to the region's economy, as vast swathes of forest land had been decimated. The ash fall, which had blanketed homes, farms, and businesses for miles, had further disrupted daily life, causing widespread destruction of crops and infrastructure. The environmental impact was also catastrophic. The blast zone, once rich in flora and fauna, was now a vast, lifeless expanse. The loss of vegetation meant that the soil would no longer be able to support agriculture, and it would take years for nature to begin the slow process of recovery. The ecosystems that had existed for centuries were disrupted, and many species of animals, including some native to the area, were forced to adapt or perish. Spirit Lake, a pristine natural wonder that had been a popular recreational spot before the eruption, was severely affected. The massive mudflows, which had poured into the lake during the eruption, raised its water level significantly and caused debris to flood its shores. The once beautiful lake was now clogged with ash, logs, and other debris. The volcanic ash, which had fallen over 11 states, also had a profound impact on both the local and national level. The ash cloud, which reached high into the atmosphere, disrupted air travel, forcing airports to close and delaying flights for days. It was so thick that it caused the sky to turn dark, even in cities far from Mount St Helens. On the ground, the ash created a choking haze that made it difficult to breathe, with residents wearing masks and trying to protect themselves from inhaling the dangerous particles. The ash also contaminated drinking water supplies, and it took months for affected communities to restore normal services. Many areas had to undergo extensive cleanup efforts as the fine ash found its way into everything: homes, businesses, and even the engines of vehicles, which caused mechanical failures and accidents. The economic effects of the eruption were felt across the Pacific Northwest, especially in the timber industry, which had been one of the region's largest sources of income. With vast tracts of forest destroyed, the timber industry faced significant challenges in its recovery. It would take years to restore even a fraction of the lost forest, and the region's economy was forced to adjust to the new reality of a world without the towering trees that had once stood proudly along the mountainsides. Despite the overwhelming loss and destruction, Mount St Helens also became a symbol of resilience and renewal. Over time, the area began to recover. Volunteers, scientists, and local communities worked together to rebuild roads, clean up debris, and restore services. Scientists, too, saw the eruption as an opportunity to study the rapid changes the ecosystem and the rebirth of the land. Over the decades that followed, the landscape slowly began to show signs of life once again, with new plant species growing and animals gradually returning to the region. It became a living laboratory where researchers studied the resilience of nature and the ability of ecosystems to recover from catastrophic events. While the recovery process took years, the eruption also provided vital lessons for the scientific community. The eruption of Mount St Helens demonstrated the unpredictability of volcanic activity and the importance of monitoring volcanoes closely. The disaster prompted changes in volcanic monitoring methods, as well as improvements in early warning systems for residents living near active volcanoes. The lessons learned from Mount St Helens helped save countless lives in future eruptions and made the world more prepared for volcanic events. Though Mount St Helens has slowly healed over time, it remains an enduring reminder of the power of nature and the unpredictable forces that shape our planet. The eruption was a humbling moment in history, one that left scars on the land and the people who witnessed it, but also gave birth to new opportunities for scientific discovery and environmental renewal. The mountain itself stands as a monument to resilience, both human and natural, and serves as a constant reminder that while we can never fully control the forces of nature, we can learn from them, adapt, and rebuild. Hurricane Gilbert was one of the most destructive and intense hurricanes ever recorded in the Atlantic. In fact, when it hit in 1988, it was considered the most powerful hurricane in the Atlantic basin in terms of barometric pressure, a record that stood until 2005 when Hurricane Wilma surpassed it. Gilbert formed during the 1988 Atlantic hurricane season, which had already been active. However, no one expected the level of devastation this storm would bring. The story of Hurricane Gilbert starts in early September 1988. It began as a tropical wave off the northwestern coast of Africa, like many Atlantic hurricanes do. As it crossed the Atlantic, it gradually gained strength, eventually growing into a massive Category 5 hurricane, the most powerful on the Saffir-Simpson scale. At its peak, it had sustained winds of 185 miles per hour, and its massive wind field stretched up to 575 miles in diameter, making it one of the largest hurricanes ever observed in the Atlantic. Gilbert first made landfall in Jamaica on September 12, 1988. Before continuing its path of destruction through the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, the storm's sheer size and strength made it one of the most dangerous and costly hurricanes in history, leaving a path of devastation in its wake. Entire regions were flattened, thousands of homes were destroyed, and it led to the deaths of over 400 people. The storm caused approximately $3 billion in damage, and its name was retired forever due to its catastrophic impact. In the aftermath, Hurricane Gilbert left an indelible mark on the Caribbean, Mexico, and the Gulf Coast. Its widespread destruction to communities, lives, and economies made it a defining moment for the Atlantic hurricane season of 1988. This storm was one of the worst natural disasters of the time, and it took years for many affected regions to fully recover. To understand the full scope of this devastating event, we need to look at how it all began and how it grew into the monster storm that it became. Hurricane Gilbert's origins can be traced back to a tropical wave, a low-pressure system moving from east to west, that moved off the coast of Africa on September 3, 1988. For several days, this wave traveled across the Atlantic, remaining relatively disorganized. However, on September 8th, satellite images revealed that the system was starting to develop a well-defined circulation center. At this point, it was located roughly 400 miles east of Barbados, and meteorologists began to take notice. By the next day, the National Hurricane Center, NHC, classified it as a tropical depression, the 12th of the season. As the tropical depression moved west-northwestward, it encountered favorable conditions for strengthening: warm ocean waters and low wind shear. On September 9th, the depression intensified into Tropical Storm Gilbert. Over the next few days, it steadily gained strength as it passed through the Lesser Antilles, bringing high winds and heavy rains to the islands. By late on September 10th, Gilbert had intensified into a hurricane as it moved south of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. By this time, warnings were being issued across the Caribbean. Gilbert's rapid intensification continued. On September 11th, it became a Category 3 major hurricane, with winds of 125 miles per hour. It was clear that this was no ordinary storm, and preparations were ramping up across the Caribbean. In Jamaica, hurricane warnings were issued, and residents were urged to evacuate coastal areas and prepare for the worst. Schools, businesses, and government offices were closed, and thousands of people sought shelter. Airlines canceled flights to and from the region, and in the Cayman Islands, residents were evacuated by Cayman Airways as the storm barreled toward them. Across the region, people were bracing for a potentially catastrophic event. Despite these preparations, many did not fully realize the scale of the disaster they were about to face. On September 12th, Gilbert made landfall on Jamaica as a Category 3 hurricane. It was the first major hurricane to hit the island directly in over 30 years. The storm's 15-mile-wide eye passed directly over the island, battering it with torrential rains and devastating winds. But this was just the beginning, as Gilbert was about to grow even stronger as it moved back over open waters. Hurricane Gilbert's most destructive phase began after it made landfall in Jamaica on September 12, 1988. While Jamaica bore the brunt of the storm initially, this was only the start of Gilbert's deadly path through the Caribbean and beyond. After devastating Jamaica, the storm moved westward into the warm waters of the Caribbean Sea, where it rapidly intensified. Within hours, Gilbert had reached Category 5 intensity, the highest possible rating on the Saffir-Simpson scale. By September 13th, Gilbert had become a monster storm with sustained winds of 185 miles per hour, and its central pressure had dropped to 888 millibars, making it the most intense hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic up until that time. As Gilbert approached Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, its massive size and strength became even more apparent. Tropical storm force winds extended outward for 575 miles from the storm's center, making it one of the largest Atlantic hurricanes ever observed. The Yucatan Peninsula was directly in Gilbert's path, and on September 14th, the storm made landfall near the island of Cozumel. At landfall, Gilbert was still a Category 5 hurricane, with winds of 165 miles per hour. The impact on the region was catastrophic. Entire communities were flattened by the powerful winds, and a massive storm surge inundated coastal areas. The popular tourist destination of Cancun saw 60% of its beaches washed away, and inland flooding extended up to 3 miles. In addition to the wind and surge, Gilbert dumped over 13 inches of rain in some parts of the Yucatan Peninsula, causing flash flooding and landslides. More than 60,000 homes were destroyed, leaving tens of thousands of people homeless. Over 80 ships sank during the storm, and many areas were completely cut off due to the damage. But Gilbert wasn't finished yet. After crossing the Yucatan, the storm weakened slightly over land, but as it moved into the Gulf of Mexico on September 15th, it began to strengthen again. By the time it made landfall in mainland Mexico on September 16th, it was a Category 3 hurricane, packing winds of 125 miles per hour. The storm moved inland, lashing the city of Monterey with heavy rain and high winds, causing widespread flooding and killing over 150 people. In total, Gilbert was responsible for killing over 430 people across the Caribbean, Mexico, and the Gulf Coast, making it one of the deadliest storms of the 20th century. But the destruction didn't end with its landfall in Mexico. The storm's remnants continued to wreak havoc as it moved north into Texas, bringing tornadoes, flooding, and additional damage. The destruction caused by Hurricane Gilbert was truly staggering. Across the Caribbean, Mexico, and parts of the United States, the storm left behind a trail of devastation that took years to recover from. In total, the storm caused nearly $3 billion in damage, making it one of the most costly hurricanes in history at the time. In Jamaica, where the storm made its first landfall, the damage was extensive. Entire communities were flattened, and many homes and businesses were destroyed. The storm left over $700 million in damage on the island, and it took years for the country to fully recover. The powerful winds and heavy rains caused widespread flooding and landslides, particularly in mountainous areas, and the island's agricultural sector was hit hard, with crops like bananas and sugarcane being wiped out. In Mexico, the impact was even more severe. The Yucatan Peninsula, particularly the coastal areas of Cancun and Cozumel, was hit hardest by Gilbert's ferocious winds and storm surge. Entire stretches of coastline were washed away, and many tourist areas were left in ruins. In the days following the storm, more than 5,000 American tourists were evacuated from Cancun, as the city's infrastructure was in tatters. The inland city of Monterrey also faced devastating flooding, as rivers overflowed their banks, washing away homes, vehicles, and even entire buses filled with people. More than 150 people were killed in Monterrey alone, many of them swept away by the raging floodwaters. Across northern Mexico, heavy rainfall caused rivers to swell and landslides to occur, leaving many areas cut off from rescue efforts. Even the United States felt the effects of Hurricane Gilbert. Though Texas narrowly avoided a direct hit, the storm's outer bands spawned tornadoes across the state, causing additional damage. Nearly 30 tornadoes were recorded in Texas, including several that caused significant destruction in the San Antonio area. The storm also caused widespread beach erosion along the Gulf Coast, though the damage in the U.S. was relatively minor compared to the destruction in the Caribbean and Mexico. In total, more than 35,000 people were left homeless by the storm, and many areas struggled to rebuild in the aftermath. The sheer scale of the destruction was unprecedented, and it took years for many of the affected regions to recover. The storm's name, Gilbert, was retired by the World Meteorological Organization in 1989 due to the extensive damage it caused, a decision made for storms that have a particularly devastating impact. Hurricane Gilbert was more than just a powerful storm. It was a catastrophic event that changed the lives of millions of people in its path. The storm's legacy is one of destruction, loss, and resilience as the affected regions work to rebuild in the years following the disaster. For Jamaica, Mexico, and the other areas hit by Gilbert, it was a sobering reminder of the power of nature and the vulnerability of coastal communities to hurricanes. One of the lasting impacts of Hurricane Gilbert was the widespread recognition of the need for better disaster preparedness and response in the Caribbean and Gulf Coast regions. In the years following the storm, many countries invested in improved forecasting and early warning systems, as well as stronger building codes and infrastructure designed to withstand hurricanes. In the scientific community, Gilbert's intensity and size provided valuable data that helped researchers better understand the behavior of Category 5 hurricanes. The storm's record-breaking low pressure and massive wind field were key factors in advancing our understanding of how hurricanes develop and intensify, especially in the warm waters of the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. Gilbert also had a profound impact on the economies of the regions it affected. In Jamaica, the storm caused extensive damage to the island's agricultural sector, particularly the banana and sugarcane industries, which took years to recover. In Mexico, the storm had a devastating impact on the tourism industry, particularly in Cancun and Cozumel. The region's economy, heavily reliant on tourism, was crippled as hotels and resorts were destroyed and thousands of tourists were evacuated in the aftermath of the storm. Despite the destruction, Hurricane Gilbert also highlighted the resilience of the people in its path. In the face of such overwhelming devastation, communities came together to rebuild and recover. In Jamaica, Mexico, and the Gulf Coast, people worked tirelessly to rebuild homes, businesses, and infrastructure in the years following the storm. Today, Gilbert remains a benchmark for other major hurricanes. Its legacy is still felt in the regions it affected, and its name is remembered as one of the most destructive storms in history. The lessons learned from Hurricane Gilbert have helped shape how we prepare for and respond to hurricanes today, ensuring that future storms, while still dangerous, will not catch us unprepared. Typhoon Nina, also known locally as Typhoon Bibeng, remains one of the most devastating storms in the history of Asia. This catastrophic event took place in early August of 1975 and became notorious not just for its strength, but for the extraordinary loss of life and destruction it caused. Before it made landfall, Typhoon Nina had already gained a reputation as a fierce and unpredictable tropical cyclone in the western Pacific Ocean, showing signs early on that it could become a catastrophic storm. The storm first began as a tropical disturbance off the coast of Guam. Warm sea surface temperatures and favorable atmospheric conditions quickly allowed the system to strengthen, and by the first few days of August, it had developed into a tropical storm. As it moved westward, heading toward the Philippines, Typhoon Nina continued to grow in size and intensity. Meteorologists tracked its progress closely, issuing early warnings to the regions in its path. Despite these warnings, the sheer power of the storm was beyond what most could imagine at the time. By the time Nina reached typhoon status, its wind speeds had accelerated dramatically. Reports later estimated that the winds at the center of the storm exceeded 120 miles per hour. As it barreled closer to the archipelago, the people of the Philippines braced for impact. The storm was moving fast, its wide wind field sweeping across the sea, pushing massive storm surges toward the coastal areas. On August 6, 1975, Typhoon Nina made landfall on Luzon, the largest and most populous island in the Philippines. It slammed into the northern regions with incredible force, bringing torrential rains, powerful gusts, and life-threatening storm surges that overwhelmed entire communities. The rains were so heavy that they caused massive flooding within hours of the storm's arrival. Coastal villages were some of the first to feel the brunt of the storm, with homes, businesses, and crops being swept away by the winds and water. But what made Typhoon Nina especially catastrophic was not just the immediate damage. As it moved inland, it triggered a series of events that would turn this typhoon into one of the most tragic natural disasters in the nation's history. After wreaking havoc in the Philippines, Typhoon Nina continued on its deadly path, leaving widespread devastation in its wake. But the storm was far from over, and its next target was even more populous. After crossing the island of Luzon, Nina weakened slightly as it moved into the South China Sea. However, the warm waters there allowed the storm to quickly regain strength, setting its sights on the southeastern coast of China. What started as a disaster for the Philippines was about to become an international catastrophe impacting millions across Asia. As the storm gained momentum, the people of China were ill-prepared for the scale of destruction that was about to strike. By early August, weather agencies in China had issued warnings for the coastal provinces, urging citizens to brace for severe flooding and landslides. Despite these warnings, the country's infrastructure, especially in rural areas, was not equipped to handle the sheer power of the approaching typhoon. On August 8, Typhoon Nina made landfall in mainland China, striking the Fujian province with full force. The winds, exceeding 120 miles per hour, tore through cities and villages alike. Entire towns were submerged as torrential rains flooded rivers, causing them to overflow and swallow everything in their path. Farmlands were destroyed, homes were flattened, and roads became impassable due to mudslides and debris. What made Nina particularly deadly in China was the failure of several dams, including the infamous collapse of the Banqiao Dam, which led to one of the deadliest dam failures in history. The Banqiao Dam, located in the Henan province, had been built to withstand massive floods, but it was no match for the intensity of Typhoon Nina. As the storm dumped massive amounts of rain over the region, water levels in the dam rose uncontrollably. On the night of August 8, the dam burst, releasing a wave of water that wiped out entire villages downstream. The resulting flood created a cascade of destruction, taking the lives of tens of thousands of people and leaving hundreds of thousands homeless. The failure of the dam was a turning point in the disaster as the floodwaters swept through the countryside, causing widespread chaos and loss of life. But the devastation didn't stop in China. Typhoon Nina's immense power affected other countries in the region as well. Taiwan, which was in the storm's direct path as it moved northward, faced heavy rains and strong winds that caused significant damage to infrastructure and agriculture. Vietnam and Laos also experienced residual effects from the typhoon, with torrential rains flooding rural areas and leaving communities stranded without food or clean water for days. In all, Typhoon Nina was a regional disaster affecting not only the Philippines, but also much of East and Southeast Asia. The scale of the destruction extended far beyond what anyone could have anticipated, with the storm leaving a lasting legacy in every country it touched. As the winds died down and the rain began to taper off, the true extent of Typhoon Nina's devastation became evident. Survivors emerged from the wreckage to find their homes destroyed and their communities in ruins. In the Philippines, the recovery efforts began almost immediately, but the sheer scale of destruction made it an uphill battle. Government agencies, alongside international organizations, mobilized to provide assistance to those affected. However, the challenges were immense, with communication lines down and roads blocked by debris, hampering relief efforts. In the Philippines, the government declared a state of emergency in the hardest-hit areas. Rescue teams were dispatched to remote locations where entire villages had been swept away and many communities were cut off from aid. Local volunteers, often risking their own safety, joined the efforts to locate survivors trapped under the rubble or stranded in isolated areas. Relief centers were set up to provide food, water, and medical assistance, but the resources quickly became strained as more people sought help. The United Nations stepped in, coordinating an international relief effort that brought supplies and aid workers from around the globe. Countries such as Japan, the United States, and Australia sent planes filled with food, medical supplies, and equipment to aid in the recovery. Non-governmental organizations also played a critical role, setting up shelters and providing essential services to those displaced by the storm. As the focus shifted to recovery in the Philippines, the situation in China became a pressing concern. With the Banqiao Dam disaster, the Chinese government faced an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. The immediate priority was to search for survivors and provide medical care to the injured. Rescue teams were deployed to the hardest-hit areas, where entire neighborhoods were submerged. Reports indicated that local hospitals were overwhelmed, struggling to care for the thousands injured in the disaster. In the wake of Typhoon Nina, the Chinese government launched a comprehensive recovery and rebuilding plan. Emergency funds were allocated to help communities recover and rebuild infrastructure. Schools, hospitals, and homes were prioritized for reconstruction, but the task was daunting. The government also faced scrutiny over the failure of the dam, prompting investigations into the quality of construction and maintenance practices that led to such a catastrophic failure. In Taiwan, Vietnam, and Laos, recovery efforts were underway as well. Local governments worked to restore power and clean up debris, but the damage to agriculture was significant, with crops destroyed and livelihoods lost. Farmers faced an uncertain future, and many communities struggled to access clean water and food supplies. In response to the regional crisis, neighboring countries also offered assistance, sharing resources and expertise to aid recovery efforts across borders. The disaster brought attention to the broader issue of climate resilience in the region. Experts and government officials began to discuss the need for better disaster preparedness, improved infrastructure, and more robust emergency response systems to mitigate the impacts of future storms. Typhoon Nina served as a harsh reminder of the vulnerability of coastal and riverine communities to the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, prompting calls for action at both local and international levels. As the weeks turned into months, the survivors of Typhoon Nina slowly began to rebuild their lives amidst the wreckage, united by their shared experience of loss and resilience. The typhoon left an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of those who lived through it, reminding them of the power of nature and the strength of community in the face of adversity. As the dust began to settle from the immediate chaos following Typhoon Nina, the region started to reflect on the lessons learned from this devastating storm. In the Philippines, discussions emerged regarding the need for stronger building codes and infrastructure improvements to withstand future typhoons. The government began collaborating with international engineering firms and disaster management organizations to assess existing structures and develop a comprehensive plan to reinforce vulnerable areas. Education on disaster preparedness became a priority as communities recognized the importance of being equipped with the knowledge and tools to respond effectively to future emergencies. Schools incorporated disaster response training into their curricula, teaching children and their families how to prepare for severe weather events, identify safe shelters, and create emergency plans. Community workshops were organized, where local leaders shared insights on resilience and recovery, fostering a culture of preparedness. In China, the Banqiao Dam disaster prompted a nationwide reevaluation of dam safety and flood management systems. The government initiated rigorous inspections of all major dams, implementing stricter regulations and maintenance schedules to prevent similar catastrophes. Public discussions around environmental sustainability gained momentum as citizens and officials alike began to understand the need for responsible management of natural resources and the impact of urban development on flood risks. The experience of Typhoon Nina also highlighted the interconnectedness of countries in the region when facing natural disasters. Regional cooperation became a focal point, with leaders from the Philippines, China, Taiwan, and other affected nations meeting to discuss joint initiatives for disaster response and recovery. They explored the establishment of a regional disaster management framework that would facilitate information sharing, resource allocation, and collaborative training exercises. In the wake of the typhoon, the economy of the affected regions took a significant hit. Agriculture suffered tremendously, particularly in the Philippines, where rice and other staple crops were destroyed. farmers struggled to recover, leading to food shortages and increased prices. Local governments, alongside international aid organizations, implemented programs to provide financial assistance and resources to farmers to help them rebuild their livelihoods. The importance of crop diversification and sustainable agricultural practices became apparent as communities sought to create more resilient farming systems, less vulnerable to extreme weather. The psychological toll of Typhoon Nina also became evident as time passed. Many survivors struggled with the trauma of loss and displacement, and mental health services became a crucial aspect of recovery efforts. Organizations trained mental health professionals to support affected individuals, providing counseling and therapy to help communities heal. The process of recovery was not just physical, but also emotional, as people learned to cope with the lasting impacts of the disaster. As the years went by, the lessons learned from Typhoon Nina shaped policy decisions and community initiatives across the region. The storm served as a wake-up call to governments, organizations, and individuals about the urgent need for disaster preparedness and resilience in the face of a changing climate. Communities became advocates for their own safety, demanding better infrastructure and more robust emergency response systems, fostering a sense of agency and empowerment. In retrospect, Typhoon Nina was a catalyst for change, driving a shift in how the region approached disaster risk management. It underscored the significance of preparedness, community engagement, and international cooperation in building a more resilient future. The memories of the storm remained vivid, a poignant reminder of nature's power and the enduring strength of those who faced its wrath. As the years passed since Typhoon Nina, communities across the affected regions continued to rebuild and reflect on the profound impact of that catastrophic event. The scars left by the typhoon remained etched in the landscape and in the hearts of those who experienced its fury, serving as a constant reminder of the vulnerability faced by populations in disaster-prone areas. Yet, amidst the memories of loss and devastation, stories of resilience and recovery emerged, illustrating the indomitable spirit of those who weathered the storm. In the Philippines, the experience of Typhoon Nina ignited a sense of unity among communities. Neighborhoods that had once been fragmented began to work together, sharing resources, knowledge, and support in ways that had not been seen before. Local organizations, strengthened by the shared experience of loss, formed networks to assist those still struggling to regain stability. Community leaders organized regular meetings to discuss ongoing challenges, ensuring that everyone had a voice in shaping their recovery and future preparedness plans. The government's commitment to improving infrastructure gained momentum, with investments made in roads, bridges, and evacuation centers designed to withstand future storms. Communities began to embrace innovative technologies such as early warning systems and mobile apps to receive real-time updates on severe weather. This integration of technology into disaster management significantly enhanced the region's ability to respond swiftly to warnings and minimize potential loss of life and property. In China, the lessons learned from the Banqiao Dam disaster prompted a national discourse on sustainable development. The emphasis on responsible urban planning and environmental conservation became central to discussions around infrastructure projects. Citizens began to advocate for policies that prioritized the environment, recognizing the delicate balance between development and nature. The government responded with initiatives aimed at restoring natural ecosystems and investing in green infrastructure to mitigate the impacts of future flooding. Throughout the region, the bonds forged in the aftermath of Typhoon Nina contributed to a greater understanding of the importance of international cooperation in disaster management. Countries across Asia began to share knowledge, resources, and best practices, forming partnerships that transcended borders. Joint training exercises and simulation drills were organized to prepare for future natural disasters, fostering a sense of solidarity and shared responsibility among nations. As communities rebuilt, there was a renewed focus on mental health support. Survivors who had endured trauma received the necessary resources to process their experiences and find healing. Mental health professionals worked tirelessly to ensure that individuals felt supported and understood, facilitating community workshops that emphasized the importance of emotional well-being. The collective healing process became a testament to the strength of community bonds as people learned to lean on one another for support. In schools, children who had lived through Typhoon Nina were empowered to become advocates for disaster preparedness. Educational programs incorporated lessons about climate change, environmental stewardship, and safety protocols, ensuring that the next generation would be better equipped to face the challenges posed by natural disasters. Young voices emerge as powerful agents of change, driving conversations about sustainability and resilience within their communities. As Typhoon Nina faded into the past, its legacy continued to shape policies, practices, and mindsets across the region. The storm had been a devastating event, but it also served as a catalyst for transformation, prompting societies to confront their vulnerabilities and take proactive steps toward building a safer, more resilient future. In reflection, Typhoon Nina taught invaluable lessons about the power of community, the importance of preparedness, and the need for collective action in the face of adversity. As people moved forward, they carried with them the memories of those who had been lost, honoring their stories by creating a future that prioritized safety, resilience, and unity. The echoes of Typhoon Nina would forever resonate in the hearts of those who lived through it, reminding them that even in the face of nature's fury, hope and strength could rise anew.